She pushed a crumpled $5 bill across the diner counter and said, "Will you be my dad for a day?" His cigarette froze halfway to his lips. The Harleys outside seemed to lean in. The name on his jacket said trouble. The name on her tongue said hope. By the time the principal called, the little girl had already put him on her classroom roster. Parents whispered whether to call the police or pass a pie. He thumbed the bill into his pocket, started the engine, and decided some debts are paid only by showing up. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and motor oil. Outside, the highway kept breathing, long, low rumbles that rolled past the windows like distant thunder. A row of Harleys leaned on their kickstands, chrome dull with dust. Inside, a man sat alone at the counter, his jacket folded over the stool beside him as if it were a second skin. He had a cigarette between two fingers and a face that the town had learned to read as weather. Hard, lined, storm-ready. A little bell above the door jingled. Heads turned almost without meaning. Children paused with half-eaten fries. The waitress set down a pie and called a name from the kitchen. The man at the counter didn't look up. She walked straight to him. Emily was small in a way that made the world go quiet for a moment. Scuffed sneakers, hair in a messy braid, a paper napkin folded neatly around a crumpled $5 bill. She stopped at his knees and pushed the bill forward like it was a treasure, and also the only coin she owned that mattered. "Mister," she said. Her voice was careful, the kind children use when they're asking something important and very simple. "Will you be my dad for a day? It's Bring Your Dad Day. I can pay you." The cigarette froze halfway to his mouth. For a second, the diner hung between two beats of a clock. People watched because this is what small towns watch, the impossible touching the everyday. He sniffed, gave a little smirk, the kind that usually lived behind a wall and never came out. "You've got the wrong man, kid," he said, voice low and rough. He slid the bill back with a thumb the way someone pushes a card across a table. He expected her to take it and skip away, like most kids do when adults give them trouble and money at the same time. But Emily didn't take it. She put both small hands over his and held the bill there, fierce as if she were holding onto a promise. "Please," she said. "My daddy, he died. Mom works nights. I don't want to be the only one with no one." Something like a stone inside him shifted. He kept his face steady, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a soft, sudden leak in their edges, the kind you only notice if you look very close. He let out a breath that could have been a laugh, and then wasn't. "You shouldn't be buying people to come to school," he said. His voice had the same gravel it always did, but it bent a little on the last word. Emily's lip trembled. "I don't want people to feel sorry for me," she said. "I just want someone to stand there with me." The man glanced at the napkin, at the number 5 in shaky little blue ink. He looked at her shoes, at the scrape on her knee. He looked at the faded patch on his own jacket folded on the stool, and then away. The diner's light made the chrome on his ring catch like a small star. For a heartbeat, he was a map of old roads and older regrets. He pushed his jacket back onto the stool, the way a man clears a place for something he didn't know he needed to finish. He tugged the cigarette from his fingers and ground it into the ashtray without looking. "Name?" he asked. "Emily," she said. "Emily." He tasted the name like it might have belonged to someone he once knew. He reached into his back pocket and fumbled for something that looked like a habit, a bracelet, thin silver, with a tiny heart charm chained to it. He rolled it once in his palm, the name on the charm catching the light the way a memory does. He'd worn it on days that used to belong to someone else, to a little girl who loved daisies and thought the world would never hurt her. He had lost her a long time ago, and the ache still fit him like a second skin. He did not put the bracelet on her. Instead, he stared at the $5 bill again and then at the girl. You sure? He asked, because the question was also a test for himself. Yes, she said, eyes wide and plain. Please. Just for the day. Around them, cups clinked, and a radio played a country song no one could remember the words to. The waitress watched, hands folded on the counter like she was holding her breath between her palms. A couple of bikers at the far end traded looks, amusement edged with curiosity. He slid the bill into his wallet and closed it deliberately. He stood up, slow, like a man waking from a long, punishing sleep. The leather of his jacket creaked when he put on. He kept his voice small. Okay, he said. I'll come. But you got to tell me where to go. I don't do much. Emily's face broke into a smile, so big it seemed to fill the whole diner. She grabbed his hand like she'd been given the sun. You'll come, right? You won't let me stand there alone. He felt something push at his ribs, a small, sharp hope that made him remember a child's laugh, and the way it used to make other things make sense. He nodded before he could talk himself out of it. As they walked out toward the bikes, people returned to their meals and their day, but the air had shifted like weather after rain. The man's name, he would tell them later to people who asked and to those who wouldn't, Michael. But everyone in town already had a name for him, the one that fit his shadow better, Crow. Emily let go of his hand only at the bike, and even then she glanced up at him as if making a small, solemn pact. Crow swung a leg over the seat, like a man climbing a story he knew by heart. He started the engine. The sound rolled out deep and honest, and for the first time in a long while the noise of a motorcycle sounded like an answer. Do you think he'll really show up at the school? The little town asked itself quietly, watching the taillight disappear down the road. He lived where the asphalt thinned into dust, in a trailer that smelled of oil, leather, and old winters. The town's edge was where his life had chosen to settle, a line of scrub brush, a sagging fence, and a garage that never quite closed. People nodded at him from a distance, the way you nod at an old streetlight. Useful, familiar, best not stared at too long. They called him Crow because his jacket was as black as a crow's wing and because nicknames stick harder than truth. His given name was Michael, written in a neat hand on the back of an old photograph he kept under the toolbox. The photo was of a child with a missing tooth and a sunburned nose, holding a daisy like it was the best thing she'd ever found. He kept the picture where his hands could find it in the dark. It was there when the house was too loud and when the nights were too long. During the day, Michael fixed what other people thought was beyond fixing. Cars, bikes, old lawnmowers. If it had a stubborn heart, he knew how to coax it back to rhythm. The work kept him quiet and honest. Grease under his fingernails felt less like a stain and more like armor. Folks still brought him jobs. They would not shake his hand at the town cookout, but they would ride out with a flat tire and come back with a cooler of beer and a nod. Small treaties, barter for normalcy. At noon he would sit on the stoop of the garage with a chipped coffee cup and watch the highway move. Engines were music he understood without having to speak. Sometimes he'd count the young fathers and their sons, a ritual that often left him hollow in the middle, a slow, empty ache that sat below his sternum. The bracelet on his wrist, a thin silver loop with a little heart, weighed him down like truth. He had not taken it off since the funeral. He had not thrown it away either. It was both an anchor and a wound. The club was a shadow that never wholly left him. Once, being a Hell's Angel had been his whole world. Loyalty carved into leather, evenings that ran late into 100 gray deals, a brotherhood that demanded everything and returned pieces. The years had piled up until one night everything that mattered slipped through his hands, a choice, a ride, a wrong place. And a child's laughter stopped being a sound he could trust. Grace's name was stitched into his silence the way a scar is stitched into skin, permanent and raw. He had left the chapter in a way that left questions instead of answers. Some nights men showed up at the garage, a little disappointed, a little threatening. He'd mended a few fences with his hands and more with his silence. He tried to be nothing and to be good at it. A man who kept to the road, paid his bills, and did not take more than what life offered. But the past had a way of arriving at the diner counter or in a glint of someone else's wristwatch. It reminded him that redemption does not come by asking politely. On the other side of town, Emily lived in a smaller, thinner world. Her mother, Sarah, worked evening shifts at the laundromat and at a diner, stacking other people's lives into machines so she could keep their own life together. Bills slipped past like slow tides. Sometimes the lights stayed on, sometimes they did not. Emily learned the precise weight of worry for a child, how it sits like a pebble in your pocket and gets heavier when you forget about it. School was a place where who you belonged to mattered. The phrase, "bring your dad day," had landed on her like a small stone that turned out to be an avalanche. Sarah loved her daughter with the blunt, tired love of someone who has never had the luxury of anything else. She kissed scraped knees, iron shirts, and closed her face against the curious looks when she couldn't be at assemblies. She did not want pity for Emily. She wanted the kind of normalcy the other mothers had. That's what made Emily try to buy an ordinary day with $5 folded into a paper napkin. Not shame, but a child's pure sense that if someone could appear and stand there, the world would go on believing them whole. When Michael first saw Emily's face in the diner, something private and stubborn lit inside him. The memory of his own daughter, small, fierce, trusting, had a voice that the years had not managed to silence. He remembered teaching Grace to thread a shoelace, tucking her into bed while the world did its shouting outside, the absurd smallness of her palm fitting into his. Those memories were not heroic. They were ordinary and therefore harder to carry. They hurt because they were true. He had tried for months to live under the radar, a quiet man in a noisy life. But people do not always stay under the radar. The town had ways of testing that quiet: a lost dog, a stranded bike, a child with a folded $5 bill. Some things pry open doors that other things bolt shut. That evening, after Emily left with him, Michael walked back to his trailer and sat at the small kitchen table. He pulled the photograph out and traced the edge where a little hand reached for a daisy. He could feel the future and the past standing on either shoulder, asking which one he would walk with. He unfolded the small paper napkin Emily had used to hold the bill and smoothed its creases. The $5 note looked tiny and bright on his palm. For a long minute he imagined the schoolyard, a place where human stories were displayed like banners, and the little patch of grass where a child might stand and introduce the man beside her as her dad. The idea of being part of someone else's ordinary day felt dangerous and glorious at once. Across town, Sarah did the laundry and hummed to herself the way people hum to keep the cold out. She did not yet know who had gone home with her daughter or what strings had been pulled for a borrowed ordinary. She only knew Emily's small hand had been empty when she left, and that some mornings you have to hold the shape of hope yourself. Michael closed his eyes and let the garage's silence answer him. He had spent years running from who he was and from the memory of what he had lost. Maybe he thought that showing up once would mean nothing. Maybe he didn't understand that showing up could be the beginning of being someone again. Crow woke before the sun like a man with a timetable in his bones. He dressed slowly, as if the act of putting on clean clothes could rearrange the past. He scrubbed at his hands until the grease lightened, tied a plain blue shirt instead of his vest, and stared at himself in the cracked mirror until the man in the glass looked like someone who could be trusted to stand still for an hour. At the corner gas station, he bought a small bouquet, 3 store flowers wrapped in plastic, petals already frayed at the edges. He picked up a cheap card and scrawled nothing on it. The act of buying something simple felt like an apology he didn't know how to say out loud. He slid Emily's folded $5 bill back behind his own and tucked the photograph of Grace into the inner pocket until its edges warmed with his body heat. The school sat on a square of grass that still held the smell of last week's sprinklers. Children stamped their feet on the steps like a cluster of small, impatient clocks. Fathers hollered across the parking lot. Mothers fussed with hair and buttons. Crow parked at the curb, the motorcycle a low-breathing thing beside rows of minivans and sedans. He killed the engine and felt the silence fall heavy, like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. He walked up the steps, holding the flowers, like he carried something fragile that might break if jostled. Heads turned sharply, then slowly. There was a quiet that came in two parts. Surprise first, then the town's quick, quiet calculations. Eyes ran from his jacket to his hands to the faded ink of a tattoo at the base of his neck, the small marks that people read as a history. Emily ran to him before anyone could form a sentence. She grabbed his hand and shoved the flowers into it like she meant to stake a claim. "This is Crow," she announced to the playground as if crowning a king. Her voice was both proud and small. For one stretched second, the principal's face looked like someone cataloging a problem. A teacher stepped forward. "We have a process for visitors," she said, the words practiced, automatic. It was her job to keep the school tidy in the way of rules and safety. Crow opened his mouth. The sentence he formed, "She asked me to come," was not the kind of answer that fits neatly into paperwork. He waited for the script that would make people comfortable. It didn't come. Whispers slid through the parents like a draft. "Is he with the club?" someone asked, low enough that adults thought they were private. A father crossed his arms. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed. The principal's polite smile thinned. Then the first phone rang, a soft, quick sound that felt like a verdict. A teacher with a clipboard dialed the number at the front desk. "We need to check for identification," she said into her headset. Crow felt the word identification like the snap of a trap closing. He had expected stares. He had not expected to be turned into a file. Emily did what children do when they decide to defend something. She put her small body between Crow and the nearest adult. "He's my dad today," she insisted, loud and clean. The playground watched the small, solemn council of who belongs where. A boy snickered. Another child whispered, "Isn't he one of those?" as if the label was a coin to be tossed. Crow didn't offer explanations. He knelt, so his face was level with Emily's. He smelled of coffee and engine oil in the morning. "I'm here for her," he said simply. The teacher's hand hovered over the clipboard like someone deciding whether to push a red button. Then a car pulled up fast, the engine cutting off with a hurried clack. Sarah jumped out with a jacket half on, hair not yet tamed, eyes wide with a panic that felt like an animal's. She took in the scene in a single, sharp breath. Flowers in his hand, Emily clinging to his wrist, the cropped silhouettes of parents turned watchful. "Emily," she called. Her voice was a rope thrown through the morning. The sight of Sarah changed the temperature in Crow like a weather front. He had not meant to frighten anyone. He had not meant to be a spectacle. When Sarah reached them, words came out of her in a rush. "Where did you find him? What is going on?" Her hand shook so badly she could barely point. Emily tried to explain the way small people explain big things. Honest, plain, not yet burdened with the language of reputation. "I paid him $5, she said, and then, as if the world needed the clearer truth, I asked him to come. Crow watched Sarah's face move through disbelief, anger, and something that looked dangerously like recognition. He remembered the way his own mother had looked the first time she saw a newspaper article with his name in it, a cocktail of shame, fear, and sorrow. He felt the old shame like a hand at his throat. A parent across the yard clicked a phone camera on, the small red light like an accusing eye. Someone else muttered about the club's history. Another recalled a headline from years back. The principal stepped between them slowly, professional, but the lines around her mouth deepened. "Sir," she said, "we'll need to have a conversation in my office. The district has rules about unsupervised visitors." Her tone implied questions that were heavier than she could say on the playground. Emily's lip trembled. "They'll make me stand alone," she said. Her voice was tiny under the pressing noise. She squeezed Crow's hand so hard he felt the small bones like a warning. Crow could have folded then, let the story be a single page, and his role the paragraph that ended. He could have returned to his bike, to the quiet of Greece and dusk. Instead, something in him, that had been starved of ordinary days, turned its face toward the simple demand a child had made. He breathed in. He let the memory of Grace's palm, the way it had fit into his, trusting and sure, lock his decision. "Let her stand," he said, his voice steady enough that people paused. It was not an argument. It was a tiny claim. The principal's jaw set. Sarah's mouth tightened. The pause that followed was a pivot, the moment when a town decides whether to treat a person as threat or human. As parents argued in low tones, someone whispered, almost to themselves, "Was this supposed to happen?" The question hung in the air like dust motes in the sun. It was exactly the right question for a town that loved neat explanations. What do you think? Was he only there for a day, or had something deeper been set loose by a girl and a folded $5 bill? The principal's office smelled like old carpet, lemon cleaner, and nerves. The hum of the vending machine outside leaked faintly through the door. Crow sat on the edge of the metal chair meant for scolded students, his hands folded in front of him, knuckles faintly pale. He hadn't been in a school building in 25 years, not since the day he'd been sent home with a suspension slip and a father who never came to collect him. Sarah stood across the room, arms folded, her breath fast and uneven. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she said, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't break. Crow looked at her calmly. "She asked," he said. It was a weak defense, even though he knew that. But it was the truth, the kind of truth that sounded too simple to survive in adult rooms full of rules. The principal perched behind her desk, every movement stiff with the authority of someone used to managing chaos by labeling it. "Mr. Crow, we have safety policies for a reason. You can't just show up at a school, no ID, no notice, on a motorcycle that scares half the parents in the lot." Sarah shot him a look that could cut through metal. "You scared me too." He nodded, slow and measured. "Yeah, I figured I might." He rubbed his palm across his jeans. "But she wanted someone to show up. That's all." The principal's eyes softened slightly, but not enough to matter. "I understand that, but this situation could have gone very differently. The police were almost called." Crow's head lifted at that. "Almost." "Luckily," Sarah cut in, "I got here first." There was a silence that wasn't empty. It pulsed, like the room itself was listening. The principal sighed, the kind of sigh that means paperwork will follow. "I'll have to report this, but perhaps there's no harm done if you leave quietly now." Emily, sitting outside the glass partition, watched the three adults like a tiny judge. Her small backpack was half open, a crumpled drawing sticking out. A stick figure of her, holding hands with a man beside a motorcycle drawn in blue crayon. When Crow saw it, something trembled behind his ribs. "She drew that for me," he said quietly. Sarah looked at the paper, then back at him. "She doesn't even know you." "Maybe not," he murmured, but she recognized something. The principal excused herself for a moment, probably to take a call, and the air between the two of them changed. Sarah leaned against the desk, her anger ebbing into a tired, uneven breath. "You're not supposed to be in her life. You understand that, right?" Crow's jaw clenched. "I'm not trying to be. I'm not looking for another kid to save me from my ghosts." "Then why come?" He hesitated. "Because she believed I could show up when nobody else did. You don't turn that down, not if you've ever been the person waiting." Sarah blinked. The weight of his words reached her, not forgiveness, but recognition. The silence stretched long enough that even the vending machine outside stopped humming. After a moment, she said, "When my husband left, Emily stopped asking about him. She just started pretending. I guess she found you because pretending wasn't enough anymore." Crow looked toward the glass again. The girl waved when she caught his eye. The world outside that window was too clean for men like him, too neat for his kind of history. But the wave felt like something fragile, something sacred. He stood. "I'll leave," he said quietly. "You don't owe me a thing, but don't punish her for having a big heart." Sarah's voice softened. I won't. As he walked out, Emily sprang from her chair. Did I do something wrong? She asked, eyes wide and wet. He knelt beside her. No, sweetheart. You just reminded me what showing up means. She looked confused, then hugged him hard, the kind of hug that ignores permission. Her little hands smelled like crayons and vanilla wafers. You're still my dad for today, right? He hesitated. Behind them, Sarah's arms folded, but her face had gentled. Yeah, he said finally. For today. They walked out together into the sunlight. The world outside the school gates was louder now, traffic, shouts, life resuming as if nothing sacred had just occurred inside those walls. Parents stared, but some of them, the older ones, the ones who knew what regret looked like, turned away with quiet respect. On his bike, Emily traced her fingers over the chrome. It's louder than I thought, she whispered. He smiled faintly. Most things worth noticing are. Sarah approached slowly, the heels of her boots crunching over gravel. You're not coming back here, she said, but her tone lacked the edge it had before. I figured, he replied. She paused, then added, but, thank you, for not letting her stand alone. Crow nodded once. She stood for me too. You just didn't see it. For a long beat, they just stood there, the single mother and the biker carrying too many ghosts, connected by a child's small, impossible faith. When Emily climbed into Sarah's car, she rolled down the window. You'll come visit me again, right? Crow started the engine. The machine roared like a heartbeat. If the world lets me, he said over the sound, I will. Sarah watched him ride off until the rumble faded down the long suburban street. Something in her chest tightened. Not fear, not relief. Maybe both. Back in the rearview mirror, she saw Emily clutching the plastic-wrapped flowers to her chest. He didn't forget, the little girl said softly, almost to herself. Sarah didn't answer. She only drove on in silence, the faint smell of exhaust and roses lingering in the air like a question that hadn't yet found its ending. And somewhere down the road, Crow rode with the folded $5 bill still tucked in his jacket, a promise pressed close to his heart, still warm. How would you react if a stranger showed up for a child like that? Would you see danger or courage? What would you feel? Night settled like a wet blanket over the garage, and the little porch light buzzed with the kind of insect music that makes small things feel very big. Crow sat on the bottom step, the cup of coffee between his hands cooling until it was just warm, and the engine of his bike hummed faintly in the shadow where he'd parked it like a sleeping animal. The day's noise, the playground, the clipped words, Sarah's breath, had been scrubbed away by evening. What remained sat inside him, heavy and patient. He turned the bracelet over in his fingers. The silver heart was dull where his thumb had worn the name down to a soft blur. Sometimes he could still read the first letter, sometimes not. He had kept it because throwing it away felt like betraying memory, and keeping it felt like dragging a weight behind him. The metal warmed where it touched his skin, as if it remembered better days and wanted to pass that warmth on. A moth beat against the porch light and then slid away. He thought of Grace at 7, how she'd chase moths and call them little airplanes. He could see the freckles spattered like constellations on her nose when she laughed at nothing. Memory sharpened oddly at night. Small gestures that daylight had smoothed over came back like carvings. He remembered the smell of dish soap on Grace's hair, the way she would stack her crayons by color, the confident, ridiculous way she believed adults could fix anything if they wanted to. He remembered the last time he promised her he would be home for dinner, and the way his phone had hummed with something important that he answered anyway. The scene arrived in pieces, not as a single cinematic cut, but as fragments. The rev of a different engine, a call he thought could wait, a shortcut that looked easy on a map and wasn't. A memory that used to be a map of reasons became, in the slow dark, a tally of losses. He had told himself the choices were smaller then, a job that had to be done, a brother who needed him. But memory is a stern teacher, and in its classroom every small decision adds up to the size of the final lesson. He breathed in the night. The coffee had gone lukewarm. He set it down and let his palms rest on his knees. For the first time since the funeral, he spoke the name aloud in a voice that had no audience but the moths and the hum of the town. "Grace," he said, and the syllable broke like glass. It was not a confession to anyone else. It was an attempt to put the ache into words so it might be understood. He had learned over the years that conversations with the dead were not unheard of. You talk because silence makes you smaller. He found the photograph, slid out the pocket, and smoothed the edge with a thumb that trembled a little. Grace's grin haunted the paper. The light in her eyes felt impossible to carry, and yet he had been tasked with carrying it alone. A memory he had kept behind his jaw came forward then. Grace on the front step, a shoe untied, looking up at him with that absolute trust children manufacture like a promise. He had a choice then, as he did later, to choose a route that would have put him beside her at bedtime. He chose wrong. The field of that wrong decision had been big enough to swallow other things. Birthdays whispered, "I love you, S." The small domestic miracles that, over time, bend a life into meaning. Regret is not a single cataclysm. It is a slow weathering. Tonight it sat in him like sediment, fine and sharp. He had spent years trying to erode it with work, with small acts of quiet usefulness. He had mended bikes and hosed down oil stains, believing in the arithmetic of usefulness. Do enough good things, and they add up. But some sums don't balance on ledgers. Some debts are reckoned differently. Across the yard, a dog barked once and was still. The town's lights made a soft halo on the horizon like a distant stadium crowd. Crow pressed the bracelet to his lips for a second, a ridiculous, private ritual, as if the metal could carry his breath back to where the rest of the conversation had stalled. The motel room of his life was small and it contained few comforts. Yet here on the step, he felt something like mercy arrive unannounced. Emily's small hand in his the morning before, the bluntness of her request, the purity of her expectation. She had not known any of the ledger's math. She had known only the simple arithmetic of presence. He thought of the way she leaned into him on the playground, how uncomplicated her belief had been that a man could simply stand where another was absent and make that absence less heavy. The simplicity of her faith frightened him because it made his own failures loud. But it also lit a path forward that was not about erasing the past, but about meeting it halfway. He let the memory run and then fold back on itself until the night grew very small and very intimate. Tears came like a surprise. They didn't announce themselves with fanfare. They just slipped over his cheeks and were absorbed by the unremarkable scruff of his stubble. He did not flinch. He had been a man who held anger and denial like armor for so long that wearing vulnerability felt like a new kind of courage. He took the bracelet off and turned it in his hands until the chain clicked softly. The name on the heart was a ghost he could not clean off, nor would he. He set the bracelet on the step between them as if offering something back to the dark, then folded his hands over it, closing the small circle with his palms. It felt like putting down a small weapon and picking up a promise. The night pressed in. Somewhere, a distant clock struck the hour, and the sound seemed to tally the small things he still could do. He thought of Emily's question, the way a child asks for something simple, and the world decides whether to answer. He wondered, in a way that tasted like humility, what it meant to show up after you have broken the one person who taught you how to stay. If this was the moment he could be honest with himself, not the performative honesty that people hand out at meetings, but the brutal, low-lit kind, then the answer was clear and terrifying. He wanted to try. Not to buy forgiveness, not to erase the past, but to lean his life into the small, mundane acts that might, over time, mean something to someone else. He stood then, brushing grit from his jeans, lifting the bracelet carefully and sliding it back over his wrist. The metal did not feel lighter. It did not have to. He folded his cup into the trash, dusted his hands, and walked to the dim outline of his bike. As the low growl settled under him, the night seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time in a long stretch of years, Crow let himself believe that the smallest choices could be the beginning of a different reckoning. What did this unguarded quiet stir in you? Pity, anger, a spare hope. That question sat with him like a soft echo as he pulled his helmet down and the porch light blinked out. Crow woke before dawn the morning. He decided he would not wait for permission. The garage still smelled of the night's oil and the ghost of cigarette smoke. A single bulb swung above his workbench like a tiny, indifferent sun. He shoved his hands into grease the way some men fold prayer into their palms and set to planning with the blunt, efficient geometry of a man who knew how things fit back together. First, find Emily. He rode the back roads the way a hunger follows a scent, headlights cutting ribbons through morning fog. The cemetery lay on the town's edge, a scatter of headstones that caught the light like teeth. He found her at the bottom of a hill, small and mottled with cold, knees hugged to her chest beside a grave topped with a cheap plastic bouquet that had sagged into the dirt. She hadn't been there long. Her breath was visible in the air, small puffs that matched the rhythm of someone trying very hard not to break. Crow slid the bike to a quiet stop and watched from the lip of the road. For a second he simply studied her, how she rocked once, twice, then stills. The way she traced letters with one finger as if trying to read a map no one had shown her. He stepped in slow, boots drinking up the damp grass. She looked up like a bird startled. Then recognition pushed a thread of hope across her face. "Thought you might," he said, not a question. She didn't answer until he sat in the grass beside her. "I came to tell him about Bring Your Dad Day," she said. The words fell hard. "Mom says he'd be proud. I wanted him to know someone came." Crow reached into his pocket and brought out the bracelet. He had thought of leaving it on his wrist as armor. Now it felt like a story he was holding too tight. Without ceremony, he unclasped it and set it onto the little mound of earth. The charm pooled light for a second, and then seemed to lean into the stone like two parts finding a hole. He touched the name engraved there, as if by doing so he might braid the broken lines of time into something that kept. "She'd have liked you," he said, and the sentence landed between them like something soft and true. Emily's shoulders shuddered. "Do you think she would?" she asked. Her voice had a small, practical courage, the sort that comes when children try to arrange the world into proofs. Crow nodded. "Yeah." He let the words be enough, because sometimes they are. They sat until a sun-salting of light bled across the grass. The town was waking in soft, distant sounds. A radio, a dog, the clatter of a recycling truck. Crow felt the small, fierce need to give Emily more than a moment. She needed a reason to come back to school. She needed a seat that did not announce absence. He pictured her in class, the hush, the other children looking around. And he could not stomach the memory of her standing alone. Back at the garage, he went to work with a focus that was almost savage. The mini-bike had been a joke someone had left behind months ago, a rusted toy that would make a good parts donor. He cleaned it like a man performing a rescue. The scene was a sequence of small miracles. A seized bolt loosening under his wrench, a bent frame straightening, the carburetor coughing back to life. Paint flecks jumped into the air as he sanded. Fumes filled the room like the smell of new intent. He bought a tin of cheap pink paint from the hardware store, and when the cashier raised an eyebrow, he told her, for a girl who needs to smile. She didn't ask questions. He worked through the day. There were phone calls he ignored, and a few curious glances from neighbors he waved away. He welded a patch where rust had eaten the chassis, returned the engine until it hummed the sound of a small, content animal. He wrapped the handlebars in tape pulled from an old roll, tying knots the way people used to tie promises. At one point he paused, fingers inked with grease, and thought of Grace threading a shoelace. How small gestures could become prophecies. He painted the tiny bike with deliberate strokes, each coat a claim. When he rode into Emily's driveway, the little machine looked absurdly triumphant, pink and patched and pulsing with a tiny, honest growl. He brought it up to the porch and knocked so gently he almost didn't. Sarah opened the door with her defenses half up, half exhausted. She had been awake for hours, eyes ringed by a businesslike fear. For an instant the old reflexes flared, to recoil, to distrust. But then she saw the bike and the way Emily's face, at the swing of the doorway, flickered from worry to something dangerously like joy. "I fixed it," Crow said simply. Figured she might need a reason to come back. Emily launched herself at him, silent and hard, gripping his jacket like an anchor. Sarah's shoulders moved. She did not shove them apart. Instead, she listened as Crow explained, in small rational pieces, what he'd done and why. He didn't promise miracles. He promised to be there. He spoke of the cemetery and of the way the bracelet had looked on the stone, like a small piece. Sarah met his eyes, and, for the first time since the playground, something shifted in her. It was not surrender. It was a tired, careful acceptance that human hearts sometimes take help in odd shapes. "You can't just," she began, then stopped, the sentence collapsing into something softer. "You can stay for a bit," she said finally. "Watch her. Make sure she doesn't fall off that thing." He laughed once, a private sound that made Emily giggle. "I'll keep an eye," he said. "I'll teach her to ride properly." They spent the afternoon in a triangle of small instruction, a mother watching, the man kneeling to steady, the child daring the world. Crow's hands, so good with engines, found a different kind of work, guiding, steadying, clapping when Emily managed a wobble and then a straight roll. The neighborhood kids edged closer, curiosity replacing caution, and the bike's pink shimmer drew nearer like a small lighthouse. That night, as the sun slid low and the porch light blinked on, Crow sat on the curb and watched Emily wash paint off her knees. He felt something in his chest that was not entirely sorrow, a raw, rebuilding warmth. He had come to fix a bike and found himself practicing how to be a person again. He tucked the $5 bill back into his wallet, not as payment, but as a talisman. The wrapped coin had started this small revolution, but it would not be what kept it going. He had learned something fierce that afternoon. Action, even the humble kind, rewires a life. As Crow kicked the stand up and rolled away, Emily waving from the porch with soap-smudged fingers, he wondered aloud into the cooling air whether a few good rides could make up for years of distance, and if one day of showing up could be the first line of a different story. "What do you think will happen next?" the road seemed to ask, his engine answering with a steady, hopeful rumble. The morning of the makeup assembly arrived like a small, careful blessing. Pale sun, a cool wind that made flags at the flagpole lean politely, and the school's playground uncluttered by last week's nervousness. Crow had not slept well. The garage smelled of oil and paint and the faint residue of a night spent thinking. He had a shirt on that wasn't his usual road armor. Sleeves rolled, so his forearms looked less like tools and more like arms that could hold a child. He kept his wallet closed around the $5 bill. It felt less like cash now, and more like a seed. Parents trickled in, faces adjusted and cautious. The principal had made arrangements after a long phone call, and word had spread that the school would give Emily a second chance to stand beside someone. There were still a few curious stares. Old habits die slowly, but the air felt different, as if the town had been given room to choose how it wanted to be seen. Crow arrived early and sat on a bench by the gym's doors, hands folded, watching children run with the kind of ferocious ease only kids still own. Emily spotted him from 100 feet and charged, hair in sunlit motion, clutching the pink mini-bike's ribbon like a flag. She flung herself at him with a kind of abandon that makes grown men forget their guarded rules. "You came," she shouted, voice full and triumphant. He let himself be pulled into the celebration, and for a moment he forgot to count the past in the ways he used to. The principal greeted him with a formal smile that had learned generosity. Sarah stood at the back of the gym, arms crossed, face folded in thought. She watched Emily and Crow, and did not step forward. That hesitation was not refusal. It was a mother's perimeter, cautious and careful. When it was time for introductions, the gym hummed with expectation. Children lined up, feet shuffling, parents on the edge of their seats like judges who remember mercy only in stories. Emily gripped Crow's hand the way a weathered sailor grips a rope in a storm. The microphone felt enormous when the teacher put it in the little girl's hands. She climbed the short riser and looked out at the faces, then down at Crow. "He's not really my dad," she said, voice steady and small. "But he showed up." The auditorium caught at the edges of that sentence and held its breath. There were a few polite claps, the kind people give when they want to show they understand something complicated but don't yet know what to do with it. Crow watched Sarah then, and something in the mother's face softened a degree. The story: a man with a shadowed past, a child with a folded $5 bill, a neighborhood that had nearly turned, was being rewritten, line by line, in the quiet ways people choose to see each other. After the assembly, parents mingled and the town's gossip started to stitch itself into new colors. Not erasure, but addition. Later, outside the gym, where sunlight made dust motes look holy, Sarah approached. She had a tray of store-bought cupcakes in one hand and a guarded look that had earned its stripes. "Thank you," she said before she could think of anything else to say, "for bringing her back." Her eyes flicked to the bracelet on his wrist, the silver heart-catching light. Crow's fingers found the bracelet like a map. He had carried it through all the moments, to the grave, back into his palms, and tonight it sat against his skin like a small, stubborn truth. "I didn't fix anything," he said. "I just tried to be somewhere she needed someone." His voice was honest and low, the way it had been that first day in the diner. Sarah looked at him for a long, thin second. "You hurt us all when you were gone," she said. "Not just you, it ripples." Her words were not a charge so much as an observation. "But you showed up. That counts for something." He blinked, surprised at how much that small verdict eased the weight in his chest. "It does to me," he said. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, can he stay for the picnic?" she asked like it was the natural order of things. The question was simple and heavy all at once. Sarah's hand hovered on the cuff. Then she let it fall. "Just this once," she said, and there was a softness to it that wasn't acquiescence so much as a careful opening. They sat on a picnic blanket under a maple tree, two families in a strange, new overlap. Crow watched Emily blow the frosting from her lips, and for a stupid second he thought he could hear his past laugh at him for wanting small joy. He hid the laugh, because small joys make saints out of ordinary people, if you let them. Near the end of the picnic, when shadows leaned long and the sunlight went syrup gold, Crow reached into his pocket and fell for the $5 bill. He knew he had to make a choice that was not loud. He slid his hand out with the bracelet cupped in his palm and pushed it gently toward Emily's. "Keep it for me," he said. "Wear it when you want to remember someone's here." Emily's fingers closed around the tiny heart without ceremony. She slipped the bracelet over her wrist with the clumsy certainty of a child who handles fragile things like they are ordinary. The charm dangled, catching light like a tiny promise. Sarah watched them, something like gratitude loosening in her shoulders. Crow felt a hollow open when the metal left his skin. It was the kind of absence that makes room. He was giving away more than a piece of jewelry. He was passing along a story that someone who had loved and lost could still do small things that mattered. He didn't expect gratitude in return. The return itself was the act. Later, as Crow mounted his bike to leave, Emily ran up and pressed her small, paint-smudged face to his knee. "Come tomorrow," she whispered, and the next day. Her words weren't demands so much as prayers dressed as wishes. He hesitated, then let the engine rattle his ribs like a comforting sound. "If the world lets me," he repeated, and this time the sentence trailed off like a beginning, not an ending. As he rode away, the town's last light folding into evening, the bracelet on Emily's wrist sparkled in the dusk, a small beacon against growing dark. Crow's taillight bobbed down the road. The engine hummed a steady rhythm that matched his new, cautious heartbeat. He had come to show up for a single day and left with something he hadn't expected, the shape of a life he might live differently. Did giving away his most private memory feel like losing it, or did it finally let it breathe? The question rode with him, and for once he welcomed the company. The road was quieter than he remembered it being. a clean ribbon of black that swallowed the day's noise and left only the regular thrum of the engine beneath him. Behind him, the town grew small, porch lights, tidy hedges, the gym's flat roof angling into the dusk. On Emily's wrist, the little heart glinted like a lighthouse, too small to guide ships, but enough for a child to cling to when the water gets rough. Crow rode until the streetlights stitched a soft line across the horizon. Then he slowed, pulled to the shoulder, and let the bike idle. He took the bracelet off the girl's wrist only once more that night, before he slipped it back into his jacket pocket. It felt lighter now in a way that surprised him, not because he had given it away, but because it was doing a job he had kept trying to do with louder things, fixing engines, keeping secrets, holding grudges. A small charm, he thought, could hold a truth he hadn't been brave enough to say. People can change the shape of one another's days just by being where they are supposed to be. That evening, the $5 bill lay folded against the inside of his wallet, a thin crease worn into it from the pocket. He had meant to spend it, or maybe to fold it into some ceremony of thanks. Instead, he left it there like a tiny witness. Money couldn't pay for the work he'd begun to do, and he no longer wanted it to. It would stay as evidence that an ordinary exchange, currency for courage, had turned into something else entirely, an invitation to try. When he reached his trailer, the kitchen light was the same tired yellow it had been when Grace had still been home. He made coffee he didn't really taste and sat at the table with his palms on the wood, thinking of small, ordinary things. He remembered Grace laughing at daisy petals and the way Emily had announced, with that childlike gravity, that he was her dad for a day. Memories kept arriving like postcards, some warm, some sharp. Most of them, he realized, were invitations to be kinder than he had been before. Days threaded into one another in a new rhythm. He stopped showing up in town solely as a shadow. He mended a fence for the neighbor's old dog, fixed a lawnmower that had been left like a confession in a yard, and once, when a kid's bike chain snapped on a corner, he walked the child home rather than hand back the wreck. Each small act felt less like repair to him and more like homework for the soul, tedious at first, then oddly satisfying. The bracelet on Emily's wrist caught sunlight and scuffed with use. It never gleamed like a prize, but it stayed there, steady. Not everything changed at once. Rumors dissolved slowly. Some people still lowered their voices and measured their smiles when he rode through. But there were new calculations, too. Recognition that a person who had made terrible choices could also perform small, reliable mercies. Sarah watched that happen with the weary patience of someone who had learned to measure actions by their returns. She let Crow stay for a picnic, then for an afternoon fixing a fence, then for a Sunday when the kids from the neighborhood showed up with scraped knees and questions. Emily learned to ride properly. She learned, too, that someone could give a thing back without needing to take his own scar out of the story. One afternoon, months after that first morning at the diner, Crow sat on the garage stoop and took the bracelet from his pocket. He had cleaned it for the first time since Grace's funeral and had a laugh, because it looked foolishly bright now, like a thing newly polished. He thought of the choice he'd been given, the little hand holding a crumpled $5 bill, and how small objects had become the markers of a larger truth. You can't buy belonging, he thought. You can only offer it again and again until people begin to believe you. That was the lesson the town seemed to learn in its own slow way. Presence is not always dramatic. It is the arrival at the right time and standing there when it matters. Children, with their blunt, generous judgments, are better at measuring that than most adults. Emily never forgot how it felt to have someone in her corner. The bracelet was proof, but the memory mattered more. She grew into a small archive of moments, not just of loss, but of being noticed, of being answered. On nights when the engine was only a warm hum and the stars were clear, Crow would tell himself the truth he had been holding up like a mirror. He could not undo the past, but he could be someone who turned up the volume on the small things. Redemption, he discovered, didn't come as a trumpet. It arrived in the steady clink of tools, in the way he learned to listen and then act, In the way, he started to keep the kind of appointments that mattered to other people. The bracelet never became a talisman that fixed everything. It did not erase the shape of what had been lost. But when Emily bumped into life and the world threatened to reduce her to a simple story of absence, she could point and say, with that frankness children have, he showed up. That sentence carried weight because it described an action, not an identity. You could not define a man by his past alone if the present kept contradicting that definition. The crow kept writing. Sometimes he rode to nowhere in particular. Sometimes he rode across town to check on a fence, to return a borrowed tool, or to deliver a jar of plum jam someone's mom had made as a thank you. He still kept the $5 bill folded in his wallet, not as a promise, but as proof that a small currency of courage had been issued on one ordinary morning. He let the wind carry the sound of engines until the town's edges softened, until people began to see him by what he did rather than what he had been. At night, when the porch light blinked and the cicadas turned up, he would sometimes whisper the name of the girl he had lost and realize that whisper now sat beside the other, Emily's bright announcement, the small, insistent prayer she had made with an old bill. Those two voices did not cancel one another. They braided instead, creating an imperfect, human rope he could hold onto when the road felt too long. The moral did not arrive like a judgment. It unspooled quietly, like the tail end of a long ride. You cannot purchase compassion, but you can show up for it. You cannot reclaim every moment you've missed, but you can meet the next one with honest hands. And if a child teaches you that the simplest act, being there, matters, then perhaps the world will let you keep trying. As the night pressed cool against his jacket and the little heart warmed where it lay against his palm, he let Emily's voice live in his head one more time. You showed up. It was not a final verdict. It was, he decided, an invitation. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.